The first thing that hits you about Station 7 is the smell. It's not a bad smell, not really. It's the smell of recycled air, of 1,000 different species, pheromones, of hot metal and ozone from the docking clamps. But it's a constant smell, a heavy blanket that settles on your skin and in your lungs. You get used to it eventually. You have to. My name is Korvax. Was a flight medic, a Tier 3 trauma specialist for the Galactic Concordance's Outer Rim Relief Division. I'd seen more than my share of biological meltdowns, pandemic hotspots, and the aftermath of panicked, starving populations. I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. The assignment was routine, so much so that the briefing had felt like a low-budget holodrama. The target was a small, unassuming agricultural colony on the third moon of Kepler-12. The inhabitants were a species known as the Hreltak, a quiet, gentle race of herbivores. They had a physiology that was almost offensively fragile. They looked like a cross between a Terran deer and a bulbous insect, with 4 long, spindly legs ending in delicate, multi-jointed digits, and an elongated head with large, expressive eyes that glistened like pools of dark oil. They had no vocal cords, communicating through a complex system of bioluminescent patterns that pulsed across their hides. They were also dying, not from a war or a plague or any kind of hostile action. They were dying of sadness, or more accurately, a chronic stress-induced metabolic failure that their bodies couldn't process. The cause was a cocktail of events. A minor solar flare had disrupted their delicate crops, a trading agreement had fallen through, and the eldest of their council of elders had recently died. The stress of it all had triggered a cascade reaction in their population. Their immune systems collapsed, their fur fell out in patches, and they simply began to waste away. Their internal systems, tuned for a life of serene peace, were being poisoned by the very chemicals meant to save them in a crisis. The central medical data feed called it psychogenic necrosis. The solution, according to the Concordance's grand plan, was straightforward. A shipment of Corvaxin 7, an immunostimulant and synthetic hormone stabilizer. It was a miracle drug, a silver bullet for exactly this kind of problem. The Class 4 cargo hauler Mercy's wing was a floating pharmacy. Its cargo bay, where I was stationed, was filled with hundreds of thousands of vials of Corvaxin 7, neatly stacked in climate-controlled, sterile containers. The air in the bay was sharp with the scent of medical-grade antiseptic. It smelled like hope, or at least, the synthetic, mass-produced version of it. There were 5 of us on the medical team, a motley crew of species united by a singular purpose. There was Captain Xylos, a stern-faced, scaled Zalari with a voice like grinding rocks. He was all protocol and procedure. His second, a nervous, chirping avian named Peter, who was in charge of inventory. Then there was me and 2 junior techs, all of us going over procedures for the 100th time. Captain Xylos had given the pre-drop briefing with his usual grim efficiency. The indigenous population is in a state of advanced psychological collapse. They are not hostile, but they are likely to be unresponsive or erratic. Our contact, a local representative, is a being named Cathar. We will not engage with the general population. We will deliver the medication to Cathar at the designated drop zone, process the biological verification, and depart. Simple. That was the plan anyway, simple. The drop zone was a clearing at the edge of what had once been a thriving village. It was a strange, desolate place. The ground was covered in a thick, purple moss that glowed faintly in the light of the twin stars. The air when we stepped out was thick and humid, smelling of damp earth and decaying vegetation. It was profoundly quiet. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just the faint, mournful sigh of the wind. And the Hreltak, they were gathered in the shadows of the strange, spiral-shaped trees that lined the clearing. They were huddled together, their 4 legs barely supporting them, their hides a dull, sickly gray. Their magnificent eyes looked like pools of stagnant water. There was no light in them. They just stared, watching, waiting. Cathar, the representative, was different. He was slightly larger, his hide a touch less gray, but even he was trembling. He stepped forward on his spindly legs, moving with a slow, deliberate shuffle that spoke of a profound exhaustion. He didn't even bother with the typical translator. He just held out a shaky, multi-jointed hand, palm up, an ancient sign of supplication. Captain Xylos, ever the professional, stepped forward. A small holographic screen flickered to life in front of him, showing the manifest. Cathar, Xylos's deep voice rumbled, a respectful tone despite its harshness. On behalf of the Galactic Concordance, we bring Corvixin 7, a full shipment, 10,000 units, more than enough to stabilize your population. Please accept this token of our support. Cathar did not react. His hand remained outstretched, his dark eyes fixed on the captain, then drifting to me, to the others. There was no recognition, no understanding, just a deep, endless sorrow. Xylos tried again, this time using his implant to directly project a simplified visual of the vials and their molecular structure. The image shimmered in the air. Cathar stared at it. He tilted his head, as if trying to understand a language that was foreign to his soul. Then he slowly, ever so slowly, lowered his hand. He looked at the Hreltak hidden in the shadows behind him. They began to make a sound. It wasn't a vocalization, but a low, vibrational hum that emanated from their chests. It was the sound of a species giving up. Peter chirped nervously behind me. They don't seem to understand, Captain. They understand, Xylos said, but his voice betrayed a sliver of doubt. It's a shock response. They need time. We'll set the crates down. They'll take them when they're ready. We began to unload. We did it with respectful, almost ritualistic care. We stacked the white, sterile crates in a neat pyramid at the edge of the clearing. The hiss of the climate seals opening was the loudest sound. The Hreltak watched. They didn't come closer. They didn't move. They just hummed that terrible, mournful sound. Hours passed. The twin stars began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows. The Hreltak had not moved. They hadn't taken a single vial. The crates sat in the clearing, gleaming white and sterile, an alien monument to a solution they couldn't even see. They're not going to take it, I said to Xylos, the words tasting like defeat. They don't trust it. It's just a dead, cold thing to them. Trust is irrelevant, Xylos snapped, though his crest of scales was drooping. It's a biological imperative. They will die without it. Then they will die, I said quietly, looking at the broken, huddled creatures. And nothing we can say or do will stop them. We're not speaking their language. Xylos fell silent. He knew I was right. That was the moment he arrived. We didn't hear him. We didn't see his ship. He just appeared from the tree line, walking with the easy, confident gait of someone who is completely at home in their own skin. He was a human. I'd seen them before, of course. Stocky, unremarkable creatures with a terrifying reputation for violence and a bafflingly stubborn resilience. They were the ones who kept stumbling into things they shouldn't, fighting things they couldn't beat, and somehow, impossibly, surviving. This one was no different. He was of average height, with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of sun-baked clay. His skin was a deep, weathered brown crisscrossed with fine lines, and his hair was a wild, untamed mane of black streaked with gray. He was dressed in simple clothes, a tunic made of rough-spun fabric, canvas trousers, and sturdy boots. He had a pack slung over one shoulder. What was he doing here? This was a Concordance-designated quarantine zone, but of course he was a human. They never followed the rules. His eyes, a startling, brilliant green, swept over the scene. The medical team in our crisp white uniforms. The gleaming white crates, the huddled gray dying Hreltak. Then he did the most unexpected thing. He smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile or a sarcastic one. It was a gentle, sad, knowing smile, a smile of understanding. He walked past us, ignoring our existence completely. He walked straight towards Cathar. The Hreltak tensed. A few of them tried to shuffle backwards, their spindly legs tangling in their fear. But this human moved slowly, deliberately. He made no sudden gestures. He didn't even look directly at them. He just knelt on the mossy ground a good 10 feet from Cathar. It was then that he reached into his pack. I expected a weapon, or maybe a holy relic, or some advanced piece of technology that would bridge the communication gap. Instead, he pulled out a small, earthenware pot. It was unremarkable. A simple, brown, unglazed thing with a cloth tied over the top. It looked like something a peasant might use to carry water. He pulled off the cloth. A glorious golden light seemed to erupt from the pot. It wasn't a physical light, but a light of the soul. A rich, deep amber color that seemed to absorb the very twilight. Then the smell hit us. It was glorious. The smell of a million wildflowers, of warm sunlight on a stone, of sweet, earthy pollen. It was a scent that bypassed the nose and went straight to the stomach, to the heart. It was a physical taste. My mouth instantly filled with a primal, undeniable hunger. It was honey. He was carrying a pot of honey. The change in the Hreltak was instantaneous and profound. Their heads snapped up. Their large, dark eyes, which had been pools of stagnant water, suddenly began to shimmer. The bioluminescent patterns on their hides flickered, sparking with a dull, hesitant light. The mournful hum faltered, and for the first time a new sound emerged. A single, tentative, questioning chirp. Cathar, who had been immobile for hours, shivered. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. His long neck craned forward, his nostrils flaring, drinking in the scent. The human didn't move. He just stayed there, kneeling, holding out the pot. Cathar sniffed again, his body vibrating with a tension we couldn't see. He was so close he could have touched the human. He didn't. He just stared, mesmerized by the golden honey. Then he did something that made our entire medical team gasp. He slowly reached out a trembling, multi-jointed hand. He didn't take the pot. He just dipped the very tip of one of his delicate digits into the honey. He pulled it out, and the golden liquid clung to his skin like a tiny, perfect jewel. He brought his finger to his mouth. He tasted it. The effect was electric. The bioluminescence on his hide exploded. A pattern of deep, rich orange and blue, so pure and vibrant, it was almost painful to look at, rippled across his body. It was a pattern none of us had ever seen before. It was a pattern of pure, unadulterated joy. He raised his head and let out a sound that was no longer a hum. It was a cry. A cry of a child waking from a nightmare, realizing that the darkness was gone. It was a cry that sounded like relief. The human finally moved. He reached out with his own blunt, calloused hand and gently, reverently placed the pot of honey on the ground between them. Then he spoke. His voice was a quiet, earthy rumble. "It's just honey," he said, his eyes fixed on Cathar's tear-filled ones. "Your elders told me your kind always had a taste for it, back in the old days before the stars took you. I found a hive high up in the mountains. It was a wild one. The bees there, they still remember you." It was the most profound, human thing I had ever witnessed. In the face of galactic medicine, of sterile science and cold, hard logic, this one man had brought a gift that was irrelevant to our data. A gift he had risked his life to get, climbing a mountain to steal from a hive of giant, aggressive insects. A gift that held no biological value we could measure, but it was a gift that held everything. It was a connection to their past, a memory of who they were. He had come offering sweetness, and for the Hreltak, that was the only medicine that could save them. The moment the human's voice faded into the silence of the clearing, the world changed. Cathar, the trembling, defeated representative of a dying people, reached down with his other hand, with an almost reverent care, and lifted the earthenware pot. He clutched it to his chest, a motion so human in its tenderness that it sent a shiver down my spine. The pot, a crude, simple thing of baked earth and wild honey, was a priceless treasure to him. He turned, his bioluminescence now pulsing with a steady, warm pattern of amber and gold. He held the pot aloft, a beacon in the dimming light, and the Hreltak in the shadows, the ones who had been huddled in a gray, silent mass of despair, began to move. They didn't rush. It wasn't a panic scramble for a resource. It was a slow, deliberate migration. They emerged from the shadows of the spiral trees, their long legs carrying them forward with a new, fragile hope. Their bioluminescent patterns, so dull and gray moments before, now began to flicker with hesitant blues and greens, mirroring the warmth from the pot. The human, still kneeling, simply watched. He had a serene expression on his weathered face, the look of a man who had just finished a long, difficult task. Captain Xylos was the first of us to break the spell. He stomped forward, his tail lashing with agitation. "This is a violation of protocol," he hissed, his translator crackling with static. "You, human, you are contaminating the drop zone. What is your designation? Identify yourself." The human didn't even look at him. He just let out a soft, low chuckle like stones rolling in a stream. "Call me Leo," he said, still watching the Hreltak. "Leo Carver. And I'm not contaminating anything, Captain. I'm doing your job for you." "Our job is to provide stabilizing medication," Xylos boomed. "Not to provide confectionery. This is a medical emergency, not a picnic." "Look at them," Leo said, gesturing with a flick of his hand. "Just look." I did, we all did. The Hreltak had gathered around Cathar. They weren't fighting over the pot, they were touching it. They were gently, carefully, each dipping a finger into the honey and lifting it to their mouths. A quiet, collective murmur of appreciation, like the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze, rose from them. Their colors were becoming stronger, brighter. The gray pallor of their skin was deepening, turning back to the healthy, vibrant shades of their ancestors. What happened next was the most astonishing part. Cathar, who had been so frail, so lost, looked up at Leo. His dark, shiny eyes met the human's green ones. There was no translator, no universal language, but there was a profound understanding. Cathar slowly reached out a hand, palm up, and touched Leo's shoulder. It was a gesture of pure, raw gratitude. Then he turned to the medical team. His gaze, for the first time, seemed to truly see us. He didn't look at the white crates of Corvixin 7. He looked past them at us. He held out his free hand, the one not holding the pot, and made a slow, beckoning gesture. Captain Xylos was frozen in place, his protocols melting into chaos. The air was thick with confusion and a strange, burgeoning hope. We were supposed to be the saviors, the bearers of the miracle drug. Instead, a man with a jar of honey had just accomplished in 10 minutes what we couldn't in 10 hours. Xylos finally snapped out of it. "We need to analyze that substance. It may contain a bioagent we haven't considered. Peter, get a spectral scanner online." Peter chirped nervously, his feathers ruffled. "Captain, I don't think that's necessary. They seem to be responding to it on a purely emotional level." Emotions don't stop cellular decay," the captain roared. "There's a rational explanation, there must be." "Maybe," Leo said, finally getting to his feet. He dusted off his knees, a simple, unassuming motion. "Or maybe, Captain, you're trying to cure a broken heart with an anti-inflammatory. Your medicine treats the symptoms of their sadness. My honey reminds them of a time they weren't sad." It was a thought that was so profoundly illogical, so entirely unscientific, that it felt like a heresy in the sterile world of the Galactic Concordance. And yet, as I watched the Hreltak, their features softening, their bodies beginning to hold themselves with a fraction more strength, I knew he was right. The medical team was left in a state of stunned paralysis. We just stood there, in our crisp, white uniforms, clutching our datapads and our scanners, rendered utterly obsolete. Hours passed. The darkness of the moon's night was illuminated by the eerie bioluminescence of the trees and the Hreltak themselves. It was like watching a garden blossom in fast forward. The Hreltak had taken the pot of honey into the center of their settlement. Leo had followed them, invited by Cathar. We were left in the clearing, surrounded by our sterile crates. Xylos had tried to make contact again, but he was ignored. He tried to push a crate forward, but the Hreltak just backed away, the fear returning to their eyes. It was clear. Their trust was with the honey. They were the once familiar, the ancient comfort. Our medicine was a foreign, cold thing. Maybe they'll take it later, Peter chirped, trying to salvage the mission. After they've emotionally stabilized. They'll never take it, Peter, I said, feeling a profound sense of weariness. Not like this. That human understood. He didn't offer them a solution. He offered them a piece of home. I walked away from the clearing, drawn by a strange compulsion. I found Leo near the edge of the village. He was sitting on a fallen log, a small crowd of Hreltak children, their bioluminescence flickering with shy curiosity, gathered around him. He was talking to them, not in any language, just with sounds. He was making a low, rumbling sound, and the children were mimicking him, their own chittering voices, so alien and yet so young, rising in a playful chorus. He was teaching them to sing. I hesitated at the edge of their circle. He looked up and saw me, that same gentle, knowing smile on his face. "Want some?" he asked, holding out a small piece of honeycomb he'd produced from his pack. I hadn't even noticed he had it. I took it gingerly. It was fragrant, waxy. I bit into it. The flavor exploded in my mouth, a burst of wildflowers in summer. It was more than a taste. It was a feeling. It was a memory of a garden, of sunshine, of safety. It was a taste of a life I had never known. "How did you know?" I asked, my voice a little choked. "How did you know it would work?" He looked at the children, who were now trying to pat his gnarled hands, their eyes wide with innocent wonder. "I didn't," he admitted. "I just know that sometimes the real medicine isn't what you put in the blood, it's what you put in the soul." He told me then. He was a third-generation colonist on this moon, a farmer. He'd lived here for 50 years before the solar flare, before the economic collapse, before everything went wrong. He had watched the Hreltak, his neighbors, fade away. He saw our ship land. He saw our gleaming crates. He knew the Concordance's plan. "I saw your medicine," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I saw a life support system, but they weren't just dying, Doc. They were forgetting who they were. They were forgetting how to be joyful." "So you went and risked your life to get that honey," I said, "for a memory." "It's not just a memory," he said, looking at the children. "It's a promise that the sweetness is still out there, that the world hasn't ended just because things got hard." That was the moment a young Hreltak, a female, stepped forward. She was tiny, her hide a beautiful, shimmering blue, and she was holding a small, perfectly round stone in her palm. It was polished to a gleam. She shyly offered it to Leo. He took it. He looked at it. Then his face broke into the most genuine, heartfelt smile I had ever seen. It was the smile of a man who knew he had been paid in the only currency that mattered. The scene was a powerful rebuke to everything we believed in. The silent communication, the emotional exchange. It was a form of healing that our medical textbooks didn't cover. Later that night, Peter's scanner, which he had been shamefully trying to keep hidden, began to beep. A long, low, continuous beep, the kind that indicated a significant biological readjustment. He held it up, his eyes wide in disbelief. "Captain," he chirped, his voice trembling, "the Hreltak, their biomarkers, they're all stabilizing. The stress hormone levels are plummeting. Their cellular regeneration rate is increasing. The effect is unprecedented." Xylos snatched the scanner from him, his jaws clenched. He stared at the readout for a long, long time. He was a creature of science and fact, and the facts were staring him in the face. The honey, the simple, unpretentious honey, was catalyzing a recovery we had failed to initiate. He didn't say anything. He just handed the scanner back to Peter and looked over at Leo, who was now sleeping soundly on a bed of soft moss, surrounded by Hreltak children. The captain's expression was one of absolute, humbled confusion. We need to access his genome, he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. There has to be something, a genetic predisposition to empathy. A biological reason why they accept him. This is not rational. Captain, I said, unable to contain myself. What if it is rational? What if the most rational thing in the universe is a simple act of kindness? What if our medicine was the irrational one all along? The captain's scales went pale. He had no answer. He just stood there, looking at the sleeping human and the revived aliens, a symbol of a species whose protocol had been beautifully, thoroughly broken by a man who offered a sweet, ancient memory instead of a cold, sterile cure. The human hadn't saved the Hreltak with a serum. He'd saved them with a story, and the story was one of love. The next cycle was a blur, a strange, beautiful, chaotic blur. Dawn on Kepler-12's third moon is a peculiar thing. The twin stars, one a blazing white, the other a cooler amber glow, don't rise so much as they gradually swim into view over the horizon. They bathe the world in a contradictory light. Shadows are deep and black, but the highlights are sharp, almost harsh. It gives everything a surreal, painted quality, like a waking dream. The village was no longer the desolate, gray place it had been. It was alive with color. The Hreltak's hides, no longer dull and muted, now blazed with a gentle, vibrant tapestry of blues, greens, and golds. Their bioluminescence, visible even in the growing light, pulsed with the rhythm of their newly restored life. The mournful hum of the day before was gone, replaced by a symphony of quiet chirps, purring rattles, and the soft, rhythmic drumming of their feet on the ground, a dance of celebration. And in the center of it all, like a strange, ancient deity, was Leo. He was sitting on the same fallen log, but the crowd around him had grown. There were dozens of Hreltak now, surrounding him in a respectful, almost worshipful semicircle. He wasn't doing anything special. He was just being. He was carving a piece of wood with a small, worn knife, shaping it into a crude but recognizable figurine of a bird. He would pause occasionally to show it to a nearby child, who would chirp in delight and reach out to touch the smooth surface. Our medical team, the official delegation, was now completely peripheral. We were the ghost at the feast. Our crates of Corvixin 7 sat forgotten in the drop zone, gleaming white, sterile, and utterly useless. Captain Xylos, who had been pacing and grumbling all morning, had finally stopped. He just sat on a rock, his tail wrapped around his legs, watching the scene with a look of profound, defeated curiosity. Peter was busy packing away his scanners, muttering about the unscientific nature of the situation. "What's a human doing living on a moon like this?" I asked Peter, trying to make sense of it all. Peter chirped, his head swiveling nervously. "According to the local census records, there's a handful of humans on these outer colonies. They're mostly hermits, loners, farmers. They fall in love with the place and they refuse to leave. The Concordance doesn't really have jurisdiction over them. They're wild cards, technically." "Wild cards," I repeated, watching Leo with a new appreciation. He was more than a wild card. He was the joker in the deck, the one that upset the entire game. Captain Xylos finally stirred. He stood up, his scales rattling. He marched over to Leo, his posture as rigid as a steel beam. The Hreltak parted for him, but they watched him with wary eyes. "I must protest, human Leo," Xylos said, his voice a strained attempt at formality. "Your actions have compromised our mission. We represent the Galactic Concordance. We had a protocol, a plan." Leo looked up from his carving, his green eyes twinkling. "Looks like the plan didn't work, Captain. The mission was to help these people, right? I helped. I don't see the problem." "The problem," Xylos said, his voice rising, "is that you didn't help. You just provided a temporary source of pleasure. We don't know what the long-term effects will be. The stress response system is complex. We need to tag them, to monitor them, to administer the proper medication." Leo laughed. It was a deep, warm sound that seemed to echo in the strange, colorful light. "Proper medication," he said, gesturing with his knife at the Hreltak around him. "They're not a specimen, Captain. They're people. They're my neighbors. They just needed to remember what it felt like to be alive." He held up the finished bird he'd carved. It was crude, with a long, curved beak and wide, unblinking eyes. "This is a kale fly," he said, handing it to a nearby Hreltak elder. "They used to be everywhere, a symbol of hope. They were the first thing the Hreltak saw when they started to recover from a hard winter." He looked at Xylos, his expression turning serious. "I didn't come with medicine, Captain, because they don't need medicine. They need connection. They need to know they're not alone. They need a reason to fight, not just a drug to numb the pain." I stepped forward, unable to contain myself. "But the metabolic failure, the necrosis, it's real. It's a physical condition." Leo nodded, his eyes on the elder who was now clutching the wooden bird with trembling hands. "I know. But the physical condition was a symptom of a broken spirit. You were trying to fix the leak in the roof, but the foundation was crumbling. My honey didn't cure the necrosis. It gave them the strength to do it themselves." It was a concept so simple, so human, that it had never occurred to us. We were so focused on the chemistry, on the data, on the sterile, predictable cure. We had completely missed the emotional architecture of the disease. The scene unfolded before us. The elder Hreltak began to move, walking slowly, majestically into the center of the clearing. The others followed, their feet drumming a slow, measured rhythm. They were performing a ceremony, a dance of rebirth. They were celebrating their return to life. Leo watched them, a sad, loving smile on his face. He looked at his hands, the calloused, work-worn hands of a farmer. He was no scientist. He was no politician. He was just a man who had listened. He had listened not with his ears, but with his heart. He had heard their silent plea for a story, a memory, a taste of who they were. Then the most beautiful alien thing happened. A young Hreltak, the same little one who had given him the polished stone, stepped forward and placed a small, delicate garland of glowing purple flowers around Leo's neck. It was a sign of honor, a sign of belonging. For the first time since I'd boarded the Mercy's wing, Captain Xylos looked utterly lost. He was a commander in the Galactic Concordance, a man whose word was law, who had faced down pirates and plagues. But he had no protocol for this. He had no script for a simple act of love. "Leave them," I said, the words tasting strange in my mouth. "We can't help them, not like this." Xylos nodded slowly, his scales losing their rigid edge. He was weary, a leader who had been defeated not by an enemy, but by a friend. Without another word, he turned and walked back towards the drop zone. The medical team followed him, a solemn procession in a world that had moved beyond them. They began to pack up the crates, their movements heavy with defeat. The white, sterile containers, symbols of all our knowledge and all our might, were being returned to the ship. A final, humiliating admission of our failure. As the last crate was loaded back onto the ship, I saw Leo, still sitting on his log, still surrounded by his new friends. He raised a hand in a simple salute. It wasn't a gesture of triumph. It wasn't a victory celebration. It was a goodbye. "Don't forget," he called out, his voice carrying on the strange alien air. "Sometimes the cure isn't in a lab, it's in a garden." As the ship's ramp began to close, sealing us back into our sterile, logical world, I took one last look at the scene below. A world of color, of life, of light. A world that had been saved by a sweet memory, a simple kindness, and a man who understood that in the vast, cold universe, the most powerful medicine is often the one that reminds you that you're not just alive, but that you're worth living for. The most powerful antidote to a broken heart was never a drug. It was a promise, carried in a jar of honey. The soft hum of the ship's engines enveloped us, a stark, mechanical contrast to the life we had left behind. We were ascending back to the cold logic of the stars, leaving behind a miracle that had no place in our manuals. Captain Xylos was silent for the entire journey back to the main station. He just stared out the viewport, his reflection a ghost against the starfield. He was a man who had been humbled by the universe. He had learned that sometimes the best science isn't about finding the answer, but about understanding the question. Days later, we received a quiet, encrypted data packet from the surface of Kepler-12's third moon. The data was an after-action report filed by the HFY themselves, translated by their new, unprecedented translator, Leo. The report was short. It didn't contain biometrics, or molecular analysis or risk assessments. It was just a single sentence. The people are grateful. They will remember your kindness, and the bees, the old ones, have returned. The image attached showed a vast golden field of flowers, and in the distance, the glint of a single small hive. It was the final chapter in a story that began with a jar of honey, a story that taught the galaxy that the most profound cure can often be found in the simplest, most forgotten places. And all it took was a human carrying a pot of sweetness to remind everyone of that truth. The galaxy was full of medicines, but it had just discovered its first taste of honey. The days that followed were a strange, silent reckoning for our medical team. Back aboard the Mercy's wing, the air felt different, thinner, colder. The familiar hum of the recyclers and the soft blue glow of the diagnostic panels, once comforting in their predictability, now felt like the walls of a tomb. We had returned from that moon as ghosts, haunted by a memory we couldn't process. Captain Xylos had sequestered himself in his quarters. He emerged only for meals, and even then he said little. His scales, usually a proud, burnished gold, had taken on a dull, ashen hue. I had seen that look before, in soldiers who had lost a battle they never saw coming. It was the look of a man questioning everything he believed. Peter, for his part, had thrown himself into an obsessive analysis of the data we had collected. His small, avian form hunched over his console day and night, his feathers in a permanent state of disarray. He was convinced there was a scientific explanation he had missed, some chemical compound in the honey that had triggered the recovery. He ran every simulation, every spectral analysis, every genetic marker we had on file. He found nothing. "The honey is honey," he finally confessed to me one evening, his voice a tired chirp. "It's composed of simple sugars, trace enzymes, and pollen. There's nothing there that should trigger a systemic recovery. It's nutritionally negligible for the HFY. They can't even properly digest it. It's illogical." "It was never about logic, Peter," I said, placing a hand on his trembling wing. "It was about memory." He looked at me, his large, dark eyes filled with a profound, bird-like confusion. "But memories don't cure necrosis." "No," I agreed, "but they give you the will to fight it, and sometimes that's all you need." He didn't respond. He just turned back to his console, his talons tapping nervously against the keys, still searching for an answer in the cold, unfeeling data. I found myself staring out the viewport, watching the stars blur past. The vastness of space, once a source of wonder and excitement, now felt impossibly empty. I thought about Leo, sitting on his log, surrounded by his friends. I thought about the way he had looked at the HFY children, his face soft with a love that had no agenda. He had given them a gift that cost him nothing but risk, and it had been worth more than all the medicine in the galaxy. It was a lesson that burned. A week passed, a full, standard concordance week. The ship was quiet, the crew going through the motions of our routine with a strange, hollow mechanicalness. We were heading to a refueling station on the edge of the sector, a place called Port Asylum. It was a notorious haven for the dispossessed, the rogue, and the forgotten. It was also, according to the ship's records, where Leo's file had originated. Captain Xylos, who had barely spoken to anyone, called me to his quarters on the evening before we were due to dock. His voice over the comm was flat, devoid of its usual commanding edge. I entered his quarters to find him sitting in the dark, the only light coming from a small, holographic projection on his desk. It was the image of the Hreltak village, captured just before we left. The colors, the light, the dancing figures. It was a frozen moment of joy. "Korvax," he said, his voice a low rumble, "sit." I obeyed, taking a seat across from him. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. "I have been reviewing our mission logs," he finally said, his gaze fixed on the hologram. "Over and over, I have cross-referenced every protocol, every medical directive, every contingency plan. I have tried to find the point where we failed." He paused, his claws tapping a slow, rhythmic beat on the desk. "I cannot find it. We did everything correctly. We followed the procedures. We provided the exact, approved, scientifically verified solution." "Then why," he said, finally turning to look at me, his eyes burning with a raw, unguarded intensity, "did we fail?" I took a deep breath. This was the moment I had been dreading, the moment where I had to put into words the unspoken truth that had been festering in my mind since that day on the moon. "Because, Captain," I said, choosing my words carefully, "we were treating a disease. Leo was treating a person." Xylos flinched as if I had struck him. "What is the difference?" "The disease was a symptom," I said, leaning forward. "The necrosis was a manifestation of their despair. We tried to fix the chemical imbalance, but we couldn't fix the reason for the imbalance. We couldn't give them a reason to want to be balanced." "Leo didn't give them medicine," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "He gave them a memory. He gave them a taste of their past, a reminder that the world was still a sweet place. He wasn't healing their bodies. He was healing their souls, and their bodies in turn healed themselves." Xylos was silent for a long, long time. The hologram flickered, the dancing Hreltak casting their ghostly light across his face. "Souls," he finally repeated, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "We do not treat souls, Korvax. We are not priests. We are medical professionals. We deal in facts in cells in biochemistry." "Then maybe," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "we need to learn." He didn't respond. He just turned back to the hologram, his eyes searching the frozen image of joy for an answer he couldn't find. We docked at Port Asylum the next day. It was everything I expected and more. A sprawling, chaotic web of scavenged hulls and jury-rigged habitats, floating in the void like a metallic, cancerous growth. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, exotic spices, and the ever-present tang of recycled waste. It was the kind of place where the Concordance's long arm of the law didn't quite reach, a haven for those who lived on the fringes. The captain had given me a single task: find Leo Carver, find out more about him, find out why he had done what he did. It was a mission that felt more like a pilgrimage than a command. The information was easy enough to come by. A few credits to the right information broker, and I had a datapad filled with his life story. It was, for a human, remarkably unremarkable. Leo Carver was born on a terrestrial colony, a world called New Hope. It was a farming world, a place where people grew things. He had been a farmer just like on Kepler 12. He had a wife, a woman named Alara, and a daughter, a girl named Maya. Then came the war, a territorial dispute between two neighboring systems. Leo had been conscripted, pulled from his fields and his family to fight for a cause he never believed in. He served for 10 years, 10 years of blood and fire and unimaginable loss. He saw things that would break a lesser man. He lost friends. He lost his way. When the war ended, he returned to New Hope. But the home he remembered was gone. His wife, Alara, had died in a raid while he was away. His daughter, Maya, had been adopted by a distant relative and had moved to a core world. He was alone. The world, once a place of life and growth, was now a graveyard of his past. He couldn't stay, so he left. He drifted, taking odd jobs on freighters, working as a laborer on fringe colonies. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of civilization, running from a pain that was inside him. Then 10 years ago he found Kepler-12. He found the Hreltak. He found a quiet moon where he could just be. He had built a small homestead, a little patch of earth in the middle of nowhere. He had become a hermit, a recluse, a man who had given up on the galaxy. But he hadn't given up on kindness. He had watched the Hreltak, his neighbors, quietly and without judgment. He had learned their ways, their rhythms, their quiet sorrows. He had become a part of their world, even if he didn't fully belong. And when they started to die, when the despair of the galaxy had finally reached their peaceful shores, he had done the only thing he knew how to do. He had offered them a piece of himself, a piece of sweetness in a world gone sour. I read his file and I wept. I wept for his wife. I wept for his daughter. I wept for the years of loneliness and pain. And I wept for the fact that a man who had lost everything had found a way to give everything he had left. I found him in a small, dimly lit bar on the lower decks of the station. It was a hole in the wall, the kind of place frequented by spacers and outcasts. The air was thick with smoke and the low murmur of conversations in a dozen different languages. He was sitting alone at a corner table, a half-empty glass of something amber-colored in front of him. He didn't look like a hero. He looked tired. He looked old. The vibrant, gentle man I had seen on the moon was gone, replaced by a weary, haunted shell. I slid into the seat across from him. He looked up, his green eyes meeting mine. For a moment there was no recognition. Then a flicker of something, a distant memory. "The medic from the ship," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "You followed me." "I had questions," I said. He chuckled, a low, bitter sound. "Everyone has questions. No one has answers." "Maybe," I said, leaning forward. "But I think you do. I read your file, Leo. I know about Alara. I know about Maya." His eyes hardened, the light in them dying. "Then you know why I don't have answers." I shook my head. "I think that's exactly why you do. You gave them something, Leo. You gave them hope. You gave them a reason to live. Where did you find that? Where did you find that kind of hope after everything you've been through?" He stared at his glass, the amber liquid swirling gently. The silence stretched, punctuated by the distant clatter of glasses and the low hum of the station's life support. "I didn't find it," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I grew it." He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and for the first time I saw a glimmer of that old warmth. "You think you lose hope, Doc. You think it just goes away. But it doesn't. It just goes dormant. It goes into the ground, waiting for something to wake it up. When I got to that moon, I was dead inside. I was just going through the motions. But then I saw them. I saw the Hreltak. I saw how they lived, how they loved, how they just existed, and something inside me started to stir." He took a sip of his drink, his eyes distant, lost in memory. "My daughter, Maya, she used to love honey. We had a little hive in the back of our farm. She'd help me tend to it even though she was tiny and the bees scared her. She'd dip her fingers in the honey and she'd just laugh. It was the purest sound I ever heard." He swallowed, his throat bobbing. "When I saw those Hreltak, when I saw them fading away, I saw my daughter. I saw that same look of hopelessness. They had forgotten how to laugh. They had forgotten the sweetness of life. So I went and found a hive. I climbed a mountain. I risked my life for a jar of honey, for a memory, for the sound of a child laughing." He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed but burning with a fierce, defiant light. "I didn't do it to save them, Doc. I did it to save myself. I did it to remember. I did it to remind myself that the world still held sweetness, even if I couldn't see it." "And you know what?" he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It worked. It worked for them. And it worked for me. I haven't felt this alive in 20 years. He sat back, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. "So you see, Doc, it's not a cure. It's a promise that the sweetness is still out there, and that's a promise worth fighting for." I returned to the Mercy's wing with a heavy heart and a head full of questions. I found Captain Xylos in the cargo bay, standing in front of the crates of Corvixin 7 we had brought back. They were still sealed, still sterile, still useless. "Did you find him?" he asked without turning around. "Yes," I said, "I found him." "And?" he prompted. "He's just a man, Captain," I said, walking up to stand beside him. "A broken, lonely, beautiful man. He gave them honey because it reminded him of his daughter. He gave them hope because it was the only thing he had left." Xylos was silent, his gaze fixed on the crates. "I have spent my entire life," he finally said, his voice slow and measured, "believing that the universe was a problem to be solved, a complex equation with a clear answer. I believed that if I just followed the right protocols, the right procedures, I could fix anything. Then I met a man who fixed a broken species with a jar of honey, and now I don't know what to believe." I placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that crossed species boundaries. "Maybe, Captain, that's the point. Maybe the universe isn't a problem to be solved. Maybe it's a mystery to be lived." He turned to look at me, his ancient, reptilian eyes filled with a profound, unsettling vulnerability. "And how do we live a mystery, Korvax?" I thought about Leo. I thought about the Hreltak dancing in the moonlight. I thought about the jar of honey, a gift of sweetness in a world of sorrow. "We show up," I said. "We pay attention, we offer kindness. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we find a little sweetness along the way." We never returned to Kepler-12. The Concordance, in its infinite wisdom, had classified the Hreltak as a self-resolving case. We were told to move on, to focus our resources on other crises. The bureaucracy of the galaxy had no room for miracles. But I never forgot that moon. I never forgot the colors, the light, the dancing. I never forgot Leo Carver. Years later, I received a package. It was a small, unassuming thing, sent from an unregistered address in the Outer Rim. Inside was a single, earthenware pot sealed with wax. And a note, written in a shaky human hand. "Doc, the bees are back, the flowers are blooming, and the children are laughing. I guess that's all that matters. Thank you for listening. Leo." I opened the pot. Inside, shimmering in the pale light of my quarters, was a jar of honey. Wild, golden, beautiful honey. I dipped my finger in it. I brought it to my lips. I tasted it. It was the sweetest thing I had ever known.